to our second Cocktails of Coral Talk at High Tide Aquatics. Excited about this, excited to have Matt here. Awesome reef keeper, and his husbandry skills are top notch. Yeah, with that said, here's Mr. Matt Wandell.
Thank you. Hi. Cheers, everyone. Thank you, Kenny, for providing us all with these lovely drinks. Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm going to be talking about fish that you might see on a website that say expert only or whatever, advanced. I want to kind of try to break down those barriers that people have that they're maybe reluctant to try and keep some of those fish, as well as fish that you maybe typically only see in like a public aquarium. My sort of motto is that if you can keep an SPS coral, even some of the like easier SPS corals, you can keep most of the fish that I'm going to show you in this talk. The one I would leave out of that is this one on the title card. This is a leafy sea dragon, if anybody's familiar with it. This is one that I would actually consider an expert only. And if you don't work at a public aquarium and you can't afford the $5,000 per fish, plus all the shipping charges, and so the way these are done, this is like a great example of if you treat a fish right, what seems difficult and fragile will actually be not too tough. The way these are collected for public aquariums is that there's one guy in the world who has a permit in South Australia, and he's allowed to go out and get a pregnant male once per year, bring that pregnant male into captivity, let the babies be born, raise those babies up to a certain size, return that male back to the wild, and then he can ship out all those babies out to public aquariums around the world. $5,000 a piece, so he ships them in these massive bag in a box, because at that point the shipping is really irrelevant in terms of the cost, and it's this fish that's not even that big. We feed them live mysids and give them the right temperature water, and it's usually like a 0% mortality when we get those fish in. So just kind of a story telling us like, the difference between how most of our fish get here to the US and how some other fish can be if you really, really, spend a lot of effort and money to do it right. In case you have no idea who I am, and you're wondering who this gigantically tall guy is talking to you all. By the way, I'm 6'9", if you're wondering. And I never played professional basketball. I suck at it. I'm not an athletic person at all. I used to work I've been in the hobby keeping marine aquariums since 1999. I used to work at the California Academy of Sciences. I started working there in 2007 as a coral aquarist. Worked there for about 10 years, and one of the things I helped to build and develop and manage was a 200,000 gallon reef tank that's there. Worked on that with Charles Delbake and Richard Ross, who I'm sure you're more familiar with. While there, we had other really cool projects. One of the ones that I really loved doing, that I did right before I left the academy, was this Twilight Zone project. Twilight Zone refers to deeper coral reefs, the stuff down to like 500 feet. Some of these fish that you won't see anywhere else in the world. This fish on the left is a really cool Anthias. Unfortunately, it's since passed away. I think they had it for 7 years. It's called a Secura speciosa. It doesn't really have a common name because it was the only one in the world that was ever displayed alive. And then this is a reef tank, kind of a non-photosynthetic reef tank that I set up on the right here that was in that exhibit. One of the projects that I worked on for the Twilight Zone exhibit was this pressure chamber that we built for the mesophotic fish. The idea here is that some of these fish come from very deep pressure, and when they come up to the surface, it will kill you kind of like the bends in a human will if you come up too fast. Only the fish need more time than a human does. So what this device did is seal up the fish at pressure, essentially, and then you can bring it up to the surface and then decompress it over several days rather than hours. And that allows you to get the fish, jam out of there, and go back to your resort that night so you can actually sleep, right? And we did get a patent for this device. I'm one of the inventors on the device. This is what it looks like. You can actually look it up on US Patent Office. Steinhart Aquarium there provided me with all kinds of really cool opportunities. One of which was collecting and rearing these ghost pipefish. This is a pair of ghost pipefish. Another fish that I would say probably don't try to get unless you have massive loads of money and go collect them yourself. These are the larvae. The larvae are big and robust. I have wanted for years to make this a captive breeding animal because the babies are actually fairly easy to rear. The problem is that the adults probably just need like live mysids all the time, and they only live about a year. Another cool project, pygmy seahorses. We were able to go to the Philippines and collect a pair of these ourselves. From the time we collected them to the time they were back in San Francisco was about 48 hours. So we rushed them back, babying them the whole way. Prior to going and collecting these, we worked out the husbandry on the coral that they live on. These live on a non-photosynthetic gorgonian that's very difficult to keep, and we knew we needed to keep this coral for several years before we would even try the seahorses. So we were successful with those. These are the adults, this orange one in the center here. We did raise up babies from those, which nobody's ever done before. And then this is one of the offspring at about 6 months old. You can see it's a different color. It's actually been, it changes the color to match the color of the gorgonian it's on. So. In 2016, I moved to the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And there I worked on the Splash Zone exhibit, if you're familiar with the aquarium at all. Was kind of the tropical coral guy as an aquarist for a couple years. And then in 2018 moved into my current role, which is Husbandry Operations Project Manager, which is sort of like helping develop new projects, new exhibits, and being sort of the animal's voice in those exhibits. So the newest one that we just built, opened earlier this year, is called Into the Deep, and it's an exhibit about the deep sea. We have a variety of different animals, many of which you can't see anywhere else in the world. This is a bloody belly comb jelly, big Japanese spider crab tank with a artificial whale skeleton inside of it. To do that, we have these really awesome tools at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. We have 2 ships that each have an ROV on them. So we can go into the Monterey Canyon, Monterey Bay, and explore deep down, collect animals ourselves, and bring those back to the aquarium. On the right is just a segment of some of the life support that was built and designed for this Into the Deep show. We're actually pulling the oxygen out of the seawater to provide these deep sea animals the right water quality conditions they need to thrive. And one of them is that they require low oxygen, just like where they're from, as well as very cold water, of course. So that's my resume. How am I doing so far? Okay, cool. Would you hire me? All right, cool. Good. So this fish, this is a very special fish close to my heart. This is the purple queen anthias. And this is a fish that really got me started on the journey of like trying to kind of push the boundaries of what fish can be kept. Not just at public aquariums at my job, but by people at home, and really trying to figure out like, what is it that we can do at home? What are the key parts of keeping this fish alive? And back when I first got this fish, we got a small group of them when I worked at Steinhart at 2007. You would go into books like Scott Michael's books, you'd go on Reef Central or whatever and read about them. And all you'd ever read is, forget it, they're impossible. Like literally people would say on Reef Central, you can't keep them alive, they're impossible to keep. We were determined to try, and I tried all kinds of different things. We had live mysid shrimp to feed to them. They ignored them. Live adult brine shrimp, ignored them. All kinds of different foods that we thought they were going to eat, and they didn't touch them. And so I was just baffled as to what to do, right? And it was actually a cold water aquarist that suggested baby brine shrimp to feed them, which seemed nutty to me because it was like, why would you do that? Like, it's so tiny. And it turns out that that is exactly what they love to eat. This fish, if you provide it baby brine shrimp, almost like right out of the bag, it will start eating it. And what I believe is what's going on with this fish is that it occupies a special niche on the reef where other anthias will find big copepods and big, huge animals to eat. This one has this narrow tunnel vision that only focuses on the very smallest food items that are available. And for whatever reason, its brain is just not instinctually set to eat larger food items. And so you have to provide it that small stuff. So how do you keep a fish alive that eats baby brine shrimp? It's not like you can do that twice a day, right? And keep it alive. So we set up systems such that there was basically baby brine shrimp in the tank all day long, right? This is an auto feeder on the left. Kind of hard to see what's going on, but it's basically a cooler, little igloo cooler, 1 gallon, with a peristaltic dosing pump up at the top. At public aquariums, we hatch baby brine shrimp every single day, so it was available to us. We put an ice block in that cooler, put some knops in there, and then let it drip in all day long. This is not really feasible for somebody at home, right? Nobody can do that. And we know that. But I think if you wanted to keep these fish at home, my idea is this. Rather than hatching out baby brine shrimp every day, why not hatch out baby brine shrimp once a week keep them alive throughout the week in a refrigerator and be having that dose in throughout the course of the day. I've never actually done it, but I think it would work. And there's so many awesome new technologies now to make hatching baby brine shrimp at home a lot easier. There's these magnetic cysts now that you can put a magnet under, and the unhatched cysts will stick to them. It's awesome. They're coated in like some kind of iron material. You put a magnet under it, and then it separates them all. So what I'm thinking is, if you just hatched them on the weekend, fed them out to your tank over the course of a week, by the end of the week you'd have week-old baby brine shrimp, but that would be okay. Your fish would still eat them. People have set up these like kind of elaborate auto feeders to feed their fish. One thing you can do is something like Arctopods or Tiger pods. This is a design that was originated with Steve Wiest, who is an aquarist from Oregon. This is a refrigerator, right? It's all inside of a refrigerator, and you can see there's a quad dosing pump up at the top. And the pipe that's going through the middle of the refrigerator is tank water, right? It's being pumped through 24/7 with a venturi there, and all the food gets pumped into that venturi to get dispersed into the tank. It's a lovely idea. I like it, but simply from an engineering perspective, the problem with it is you're now pumping 78-degree water through a refrigerator 24/7, right? Sure, you could insulate it, but the other problem with it too is what happens if any of that leaks, right? All things that you can say about all the plumbing in your tank, but it seems like it could be done better. So I came up with this. I have no idea if somebody's done this before me or not, but I'm going to call it the Wandell auto feeder, and people can stick with that or not. The schematic might take a while to kind of digest, but the schematic for it is on the right. It's very simple. They make awesome refrigerators nowadays that are like this big, $100, you know, the Peltier chiller type refrigerators without a compressor. Basically, I took one of those fridges, drilled 2 holes in the top for water, drilled 1 hole in the side for the power for a dosing pump. And the idea here is you have a dosing pump that you can think of it in the simplest terms as just taking water from the sump and sending it to the tank, right? But on the way there, it has a little T in it. And a second dosing pump is adding food into that T. That's all inside the fridge. So the idea is dosing pump A, the one inside the fridge, would come on at, say, noon and dose a specific amount of food at noon. And it would get into that T, still in the refrigerated part, and then, say, 1 or 2 minutes later, dosing pump B would kick on and pump in as much water as you want, really, 500 mils, whatever, and flushes that line. The benefit here is that, one, you're not you're not heating up your refrigerator by pumping warm water through it. 2, your food is either the right temperature it's supposed to be, it's cold and it's being preserved, or it's in the tank because it's immediately flushed into the tank. So that's kind of how I start with those Anthias, right? Those purple queens, is starting them with baby brine, maybe trying like Arctopods after a week or so, or Calanus, or Cyclopes, if that even exists anymore. I don't think it does. And then move on to other larger foods, because you don't want to hatch baby brine for the rest of your life for these fish, right? Nobody can do that at home. I would say if you really wanted to do purple queen Anthias, you could probably plan on keeping baby brine for the first, like, say, 1 to 2 months of keeping them, and by then you should be able to switch them to other foods. The food I really like to offer them next is frozen clam tongue, clam meat, that you rake over a little microplane zester thing. If you do that when it's frozen, you'll get this nice little mix of very teeny tiny little pieces of clam. Something about the smell of the clam, they love it. And then the size of it is just right. You strain it through a baby brine net or whatever. Another thing that I like to feed them is capelin eggs. These are also known as tobiko. If you get tobiko from Asian food store or whatever, it's usually been dyed and seasoned a little bit. It's usually like a salt mix, so you can actually rinse that out. Rinse it in tank water, in a brine shrimp net or whatever, in a bucket, and then those are ready to go to be fed to fish. They're awesome. They're small. It's a little bundle of food. It doesn't like leak juice into the tank, and then it's got packed with nutrients right inside the food. Purple queens really love both of those foods. After that, once they start recognizing stuff that's going in the water that's not maybe necessarily moving, you can start trying to do like hikari mysids, and eventually they'll take larger food items like that. So that's just one species, right? But my intent here is to basically teach a philosophy, not really go through and teach every difficult species of fish that's difficult to keep, right? It's more about how to think about it, how to keep these fish alive, right? Does anybody know who this person is on the left?
Temple Grandin.
Yes, awesome, thank you. It's Temple Grandin. She is a very unique and awesome individual. Kind of a long story, so forgive me for that. And if you're a Temple Grandin biographer, it might not be 100% accurate, but this is the gist of it. Temple Grandin grew up on a cattle ranch when she was a teenager. It was her uncle's cattle ranch long time ago. And she saw problems in the way the cattle were being treated. Temple is autistic and was very much more in tune with the cows than she was with the humans that were around her, right? And so she would spend a lot of time watching the cows, sort of communing with the cows, I guess you could say, and realized that the way the pens were built and the way that the cows were moved around was not the way they naturally wanted to move. The status quo before, when she was young, was that cattle pens and cages and things moved in 90-degree turns, right angles, to move the cattle around. That's not how cattle naturally move, and so it stressed them out. It caused them to get injured, hurt themselves, which all costs money, right? Well, this young girl said, they don't move like that. You need to move them in curves. You need to move them in circles, arcs, right? And they will be so much happier. And of course, all these people who have been doing this for decades, cattle ranching is their family work, say, this person's crazy, right? What is she even talking about? Well, it turned out that some people took on this advice and started making these curved paths for the cows to follow. It was much better, worked better, not as many injuries. The cattle were not stressed out. They weren't scared about the way they were moving as much. And that translates to better profits for the cattle industry. Since then, the entire cattle industry has adopted this method for moving animals around, right? And so the lesson here, I think, is by taking the cow's eye view of the animals, she was able to revolutionize and make things better for the cattle, right? And so what I'm suggesting and hoping to instill a philosophy of is that we all have a fish's eye view of our fish that we take care of in the tank. And this is not an unusual thing to think about, really. We're all doing it already for corals, right? People will say, I have an SPS tank, or I have a low light LPS tank, or a mushroom tank, or whatever. And what does that mean, right? It means we're altering the light, the flow, the nutrient conditions in the tank to mimic where those corals are going to be found in nature. We don't necessarily do it with fish as much, I think, but we ought to, I think. So this is a good example of, to me, what you see if you go out in the wild and see what fish do and choose their habitat, right? This is ostensibly a picture of clownfish in a sea anemone, but it's also a picture, a bad picture of pyramid butterfly fish. Those are these little white dots here down on this reef slope. And if you have been in an area like this on the edge of a reef slope, which is like this right here, just on the portion where it starts to slope down and get real steep and dive down deep into the ocean, if you've ever seen pyramid butterfly fish, this is where they hang out. And if you parse this picture and look closely at it, you'll notice not a lot of them are up near the top of this reef. They're mostly down on that reef wall. And that's where they tend to hang out, is on, a lot of times on deeper reefs on the vertical part, out catching plankton and stuff that they feed on. What's the point of this? Point is, the fish have a preferred habitat, right? And what do we do when we take this fish and we stick it in a high light, high current SPS tank? We're basically taking this fish that wants to be down here and moving it up here. Now, does this matter? For this fish, not really. It's a pretty hardy fish. They'll eat almost anything. And most people don't have any problems moving them to that sort of environment. But the lesson is thinking about where this fish wants to be, the conditions it wants to exist in, and as closely as we can replicating that will be very useful in knowing that we've tried all we can with an advanced, difficult to keep fish. So a lot of times we see at a fish store, right, everything's kind of mixed in together. You got tangs, you got wrasses, you got deep water anthias all in one tank. But in the reality, they're all from totally different parts of the reef. Even if they're both from Palau or Indonesia or whatever, doesn't mean they're found anywhere near each other in the wild, right? So this is what we would expect to see on a typical reef in the Coral Triangle, 40 to 50 feet deep, right? Very brightly lit, lots of water flow going over the tops of the corals. And these are the types of fish that we would expect to find there. Obviously tangs and rabbitfish, those guys live in high light environments where there's tons of algae growing that they can eat. You also find a lot of some of the bigger, more colorful wrasses there. You'll also find some species of angelfish, for example. But that doesn't necessarily mean you'll find them in the same sorts of habitats. So a good little lesson about a tale of two angelfish, right? These two angelfish on the right. The one on the top is probably very familiar to you, flame angelfish, right? Flame angelfish you'll find pretty much out in full view on a reef, pecking at algae. They're very charismatic, they're out, they're not really afraid, but they'll always be near a hiding place. Contrasting that is the multi-barred angelfish, usually also found shallow, but when you're diving, you'll only see these kind of if you stick your head under a table coral or stick your flashlight into a little cave or something. They're much more secretive, right? So when you're building a tank that were to house these two different angelfish, sure, you could do highlight, high flow and all that, but consider if you were to keep this fish, its natural behavior, and offer it, you know, a sort of cave environment where you know that it can retreat to and be very deep in the darkness of that and be more comfortable in coming out and feeding when it needs to. So a completely different habitat, right? These fish geographically would be found almost on Google Maps in the same exact spot, right? But a completely different environment, not really appropriate to put these fish in the same sort of tank that we would have put those last fish in. This is a deep reef. This is probably around 450 feet deep. You're not going to dive this deep. And the habitat is very different from what we saw up at the shallows. Very little coral growth. The few corals that there are these sort of like little brown potato chips that don't grow very fast at all. It's mostly sponge and coralline algae. This is all sort of ancient coral reef, so it's got lots of nooks and crannies in it. This is where you'll find things like Borbonius anthias, peppermint angelfish, ventralus anthias, and a lot of these bassets, Liopropoma, will be found on these deeper reefs, right? And these guys, you know, it would be inappropriate to keep them in a tank that's 80 degrees and high light if you're trying to maximize their comfort in your tank, right? It would be better to keep these guys in somewhere around like 72 degrees, dim. The corals don't matter, but that's what they're used to. This is a really cool spot in Palau that's called Saya's Tunnel. Has anybody ever been here? Dove this spot? It's huge. You could fly a 747 through it. It's only about 90 feet deep, so it's not super deep. But because it's so dark inside of it, inside there's this sort of micro habitat of fish that you wouldn't typically see as shallow as 90 feet because it's so dark. So you see these deeper water fish down there. Helfrich's firefish, the princess anthias, Burgess butterfly fish, and Collins angel. So what does this tell you about these fish? They like it dark, right? They're okay with a little bit warmer water. They don't mind the pressure difference, of course, but they do like it to be dark. And if you go outside of this tunnel, out to the full reef, you don't find these fish anymore. So that should tell us something about, you know, putting a fish like this in a brightly lit tank. Will it live? Sure. Would it choose to be there? Probably not. And the way I like to get a lot of this info, you know, when you're seeking out info about like how to figure this stuff out, like where is this fish that I'm looking at? Where does it live? What is it from? What habitat does it come from? I would never trust any of the things like you find online, like Live Aquaria, honestly. I hate to say it. Any of the like, I hate to single them out because that's bad. I love Live Aquaria, but anything that's selling you a fish, honestly, they're going to say whatever they want to get you to buy it, right? But if you go through books, like Scott Michael's books are really great. The other way to figure this kind of stuff out is just go dive, right? If you haven't already gone diving, and I'm always surprised by how many people don't scuba dive in the tropics that keep reef tanks. If you haven't had the opportunity to do it yet, go do it. You will learn so much about what your corals need, what they eat, things that you just don't see in your aquarium that you will see in the wild. And then one of my favorite tools actually is just Google. I usually Google the Latin name of a fish, and I type wild in there, and then I just look at images. And if you just do that, and you're certain you're actually looking at a wild image rather than a inside of an aquarium, you'll actually find out a lot of information about where they're from, what kinds of environment they live in. You can see the corals in the background and go, oh, I know that coral. I know what kind of coral, I know what kind of light that coral lives in, right? When we get fish in, the first thing we do is quarantine them. And I know that's kind of a dirty word in a way for some people, having a quarantine tank. Oh my gosh, where's it gonna go? I don't want to have this weird monstrosity in my living room. Is my wife going to allow it? Does it need to go in the garage, et cetera, et cetera? I would love if everybody sort of dropped the stigma of quarantine tanks, because they are really, really useful. For me, I think of them, it's nice to be able to make sure you're not introducing parasites to the rest of your tank, right? That's the big reason we talk about doing quarantine. But at the same time, if you're getting in a fish that's finicky and maybe doesn't take to food right away of the right type, and you want to try all kinds of different foods with it, the best place to do it is in a tank all by itself, where you can focus on just that fish. It doesn't have any competitors in the tank with it that are bullying it or whatever. It doesn't have to worry about finding a little territory. And also you can just feed the crap out of it and not have to worry about water quality and stuff like that because of your corals, right? So when we do quarantine tanks, pretty straightforward. We just have some live rock that's like in the sump. You know, we don't let a bunch of stuff grow on it. Scrub it off if you need to. A big old air stone, an ammonia alert badge, a heater. Cover it up so you don't have too much evaporation. And that's about it. And be prepared to do big water changes. I mean, it doesn't need to be elaborate, right? We put sand in there if it's a wrasse that needs to bury itself or whatever. But for the most part, you just keep it bare bottom. Do water changes with the water that's coming out of your main tank, right? This can be a 10-gallon tank or whatever. It doesn't need to be super big. So here's one fish. I'm going to start to go through some species that I find are good sort of case studies in how to keep a difficult fish and what to think about. Not going to go through every expert-only fish that's out there because that would take forever. But it's, again, more about the mindset and thinking about these things. What's important to what this fish needs. These are garden eels. It's the kind of thing you usually see at a public aquarium. People probably tend to think they're kind of delicate and touchy. And for the most part, they're actually not, really. I gotta be honest. These almost never get a parasite on them. They're somehow just invincible to parasites. I don't know how that works, but the thing about them is you just need to provide them the right environment that is typical to what they would be found in the wild. These aren't really found on reefs per se, right? They're more found in these big sand flats with lots of deep sand. Provide them with 8 inches of fine sand in an aquarium and get a group of them, not just one or two. And they will eat almost anything. They usually will eat flake food almost immediately when you put them in a tank. They do need to be fed frequently. You can probably get away with like 3 times a day, but you can feed them almost any frozen food, flake food, pellets. The real challenge with them too is as soon as something lands on the sand, they're totally uninterested in it. They'll ignore it. So what you really need to do is create a gyre flow in the tank, a flow that sweeps across the sand bed like a laminar flow and keeps the food in suspension, right? It's not to say if you have a large enough tank you can't keep corals in the background and on rocks, little bommies of corals and stuff like that. But those are the main points, and with those things, and also not having any big predatory fish in the tank, obviously, these will do great for a long time. Shrimpfish. I see lots of like articles or maybe on websites, you know, that will say, oh, these are found in seagrass and in urchin spines. And sort of this idea that they're like a species only tank and they're very delicate and all this. I feel differently about it. I think that these are actually relatively easy to keep if you can provide them baby brine shrimp and adult brine shrimp for the first month or so. They really like live food when they first come in. After that, they'll switch to Hikari mysis, Piscine mysis. They'll eat larger chunks of food. These are found on full-blown reefs. These are not restricted to seagrass areas. They are sometimes found inside the spines of long spine urchins, but they are certainly not restricted to it or obligate in that. You can put them in a SPS tank. You could put shrimp fish in either of these tanks right here, provided you can do that baby brine shrimp feed when you first get them in for the first month or so. They like to be in groups. What tends to happen over time is that the groups they'll start to fight with each other, and eventually they start forming pairs, and they start trying to kill the other ones. So you'll get usually about 3 to 4 years out of them. I think it's about their natural lifespan. An interesting thing about this fish, let me show you what it looks like when there's a group of them. You'll find them a lot of times near gorgonians. They tend to hide around those, and they kind of act like zebras in a herd, where they all have the same orientation, and there's just so many of them that a predator is kind of confused about what's going on. And you can see these guys are actively feeding. It's that little darting motion that looks like this. They're eating little copepods, little shrimp, stuff like that that's inside the gorgonian. I believe that these eat Acropora red bugs. It's a suspicion. I can't actually say I've like filmed it happening, but I have kept these in a tank with Acropora before, and red bug problems that I had before they went in just kind of went away. It's very anecdotal. I would not suggest you go out if you have red bugs and go buy a bunch of shrimp fish hoping that they will eat all your red bugs, because they will if they did, they would deplete the red bug population in like half a day, right? And then you'd still have to feed them. So, but if you do decide to keep these and set up a tank around the idea of keeping these, and you do notice that your red bugs go away, it would be interesting to hear about. Okay, another fish that's kind of heartbreaking for a lot of people, right? How many people have bought a copper-banded butterfly fish and it dies on them? Yeah, common story. We've all been there. These guys are really tough to keep because of their finickiness. They don't like to eat just about anything, sometimes. And a lot of that has to do with the way they're handled. A lot of times these are caught in Indonesia and the Philippines with cyanide, and that affects their ability to want to eat food, makes their organs shut down, makes them reluctant to feed. If that's the case, not really going to do well. Not much you can do about it. But at the same time, they're just touchy about what foods they want. So it's really about, in that first month especially, getting calories into their body. What is real nice if you can do it is have a bunch of live rocks in your sump that have tube worms, sponges, all sorts of stuff growing on them. They don't eat sponges per se, but they do eat like tube worms and little things that are inside nooks and crannies of live rock. And if you can have those growing in your sump naturally, it'll at least help get them through those first couple weeks. It'll be a natural way for them to get something to eat. Other things that they like to eat that they almost can never resist is live blackworms, having a nice supply of those on hand. This is not a food I would feed to them like long term. But again, if somebody's starving to death, you can give them some chocolate cake as calories, right? It's better than eating nothing at all, or give them bacon or whatever. I mean, it's better than not feeding them, right? Another trick I like, this fish, you know, we throw food in the water, right? And the food's floating around in front of it. This is not how copper-banded butterfly fish eat. They eat off of substrates. They don't pick food out of the water, right? So getting the food on a surface makes it more likely that it's going to stare at that surface, maybe take a peck at it. One way I like to do that is take a piece of broccoli, a little head like that, take some frozen prawns, just chop off like the tail or something, you don't need much of it, and get a cutting knife, cutting board, just start chopping away at it until it gets really, really fine. You'll eventually get to a point where it's almost like a paste. Take that paste, mash it into the head of broccoli, into those flowerets, and it will stick to it really well. Rubber band that piece of broccoli to a rock or whatever, throw it in your tank, and just watch what happens. Sometimes it'll just completely ignore it, but other times it'll go for it, and it'll start being curious about what that is and maybe take a peck at it. This is a method that I use for a lot of finicky butterfly fish, angelfish, other things that peck at the substrate, right? If you want a fish that is going to eat Aptasia in your aquarium and you're having bad luck with copper-banded butterfly fish, I always recommend that people try these two species. Both of these come from Australia. This is the Mueller's butterfly fish on the left, and then the Marginalis butterfly fish on the right. They're only found in Australia, so if you see these species, you know they've come from Australia. Just in general, fish that come from Australia are usually more pricey. They've been handled better. There's not as much of a cyanide problem there, and you usually just get a healthier fish out of these. The one on the left, of course, not as pretty, right? But if you're using it as a utility fish, doesn't matter. Regal angelfish. I used to love talking about like how to get regal angelfish to eat and stuff. It's all become moot and irrelevant because now you can buy captive bred regal angelfish. Awesome. Nice work, Biota. Yeah, so one thing that it's another country of origin thing. One thing that helps with regal angelfish is to know the difference between the two subspecies, right? The one on the top here, on the top left, is a Red Sea and Indian Ocean regal angelfish. The reason you can tell that is because its chest is yellow, whereas the Pacific version of the same species, the chest right here is more of a pale grayish blue color. The difference is important. The one from the Pacific, the one on the bottom, typically they don't come in as healthy, and it's mostly because of the countries that they're coming from, sad to say. The regal angelfish from the Red Sea are typically a lot more robust, less reluctant to feed. But again, you can buy these captive bred now. Highly recommend just doing that, because the biggest challenge with these guys is getting them to eat. With a captive bred individual, you're feeding it pellet and flake food. I mean, easy peasy. But if you did, for whatever reason, want to try a wild one, same kind of thing. These guys really like algae, sponge. You want to get them over to frozen food eventually, but similar method of, I would say, get some rocks going in your sump, the backspace of your tank, whatever, that have sponges growing all over them, and make that the spot where you can pull those rocks out and feed them to your fish in a quiet, isolated tank, right? Moorish idols. So this is another fish that I would say gets a bad rap. Real quickly, just informal poll. What do people think is the most challenging part about keeping this fish? Say it again.
Getting them to eat.
Getting them to eat. Gets huge. Yeah, fair point. Temperature, you'll find them 75, 76, up to probably 82. They come from shallow water. So, purely anecdotal, everybody has different experiences, but I've never had terrible luck getting these guys to eat stuff. Using a lot of the methods I just showed you. The broccoli, putting stuff like sponge in the tank for them. The other thing you can try is a half clam. Get a live clam, crack it open, put half of it down on the bottom of the tank. Something about the smell of clam fish really love, right? Trying all these things. Usually it's not the eating that is the challenge with these guys. What I see, in my belief, and this is purely based on anecdote, it's not like I've studied this to get a PhD in it, but I think that they are very, very susceptible to chronic low levels of stress. For example, you have one of these fish, you put it in a nice big tank with what does almost every big tank have in it, right? Tangs. And the tangs might not be chasing that fish and nipping that fish and ripping its fins off directly, but they're always bullying them, right? Think about the kid in high school who's getting bullied, but he's managed to figure out ways to not get beat up every day because he's always slinking around, right? But he's always stressed out, right? This is my sort of mindset of I think what's going on in the mind of a Moorish idol. And they're susceptible to that, and over time they just don't do well. So what I would recommend to anybody that wants to keep this fish is basically make it the king of the tank. And if you were to try and keep one in a tank like this, for example, just looking at this tank, that convict tang I would take out, right? Maybe even the rabbit fish and probably that mimic tang too. And make the Moorish idol the king of the tank. And it's also eventually going to need a bigger tank than that, right? Doing that, we kept Moorish idols for a long time at Steinhart in tanks that were not too big, right? They do great when they were the king of the tank. We'd move them into that huge 200,000 gallon reef tank. You'd think all kinds of food opportunities, big huge tank. They would usually not last in there for very long at all. And my suspicion is that it's because they're now competing with all these big huge tanks and nowhere to go. In terms of diet, back when I started keeping corals, keeping fish, people said that the Moorish idol, the long-term problem was a nutritional one, that it needed to eat sponge because a big portion of their diet is sponge in the wild, and that was why they were dying after like a year or so. I don't really buy it. I don't have a big, long list of science to back that up, but my belief is based on the fact that there's so many angelfish that eat almost exclusively sponge in their diet, and that we can keep for decades, right? Queen angelfish, French angelfish, rock beauty. All these fish eat massive amounts of sponge in the wild. I think the rock beauty is something like 97 or 98% sponge is its diet, right? Yet, I've kept this fish. This is a fish I had at Steinhart. Did great, grew huge. Never fed it a single bit of sponge, except maybe incidentally. It was eating things like krill, Missouri gel diet, Piscine mysis, those little algae tabs that you get that sink to the bottom that look like a little disc, right? Parrotfish, another one that people are sometimes reluctant to try. What's the predominant view on parrotfish, right? Is that they eat coral. They don't actually eat coral. They eat rock, yes, exactly. They actually eat algae, right? But they're eating the algae that's on the rock, and so they're biting it. And there probably are some of the really massive parrotfish that get like this big that actually are eating coral, right? But there are many species that don't do that and they leave coral alone. These are 3 that I have experience with that have actually never touched a coral. They've always been completely reef safe. You do need a big tank to keep them. The one on top is what's called the Quoy's parrotfish. It's kind of hard to find, but once you do, they're awesome fish. Bottom left is the striped parrotfish. It's from the Caribbean. These guys get eventually about this big. You can think of them as a big wrasse, right? They need a lot of swimming space, but they'll eat. You need to feed them lots of hard foods too. If you can feed them like those hard algae tabs to keep their teeth worn down. And they will nibble at live rock and stuff, and that'll keep their teeth worn down as well. But you can feed them a mostly herbivore diet, give them the kind of stuff that you would give to tangs. They're not really going to go after nori as much, and you kind of want to feed them harder stuff if you can. I would always recommend algae tabs if you can. And then this is the princess parrotfish, very closely related to the striped parrotfish, also found in the Caribbean. All 3 of these, my experience, that they've never touched corals. But hey, fish are crazy. I can't guarantee that that's always going to be the case for everyone. Tilefish. These are like spectacular looking fish. Really lovely, really beautiful. So can anybody just notice all these photos are from the wild? Anybody notice anything in common with all of these photos in terms of habitat? And yeah, near the bottom, it's kind of darker. You don't see big, massive tabling acropora around them. You don't see a whole lot of coral at all, actually, right? They're typically found in kind of rubbly zones, maybe at the bottom of the reef, deeper. Usually you're finding them down, I would say, deeper than 100 feet, right? And they typically almost always are found in pairs, something about that. You don't find them in big groups, just usually find them in pairs. I've never seen one alone, I've always seen them as a pair. That probably is fairly important in making them feel secure, right? These are a very skittish fish. They need to have a spot that they can feel is comfortable and home to them. Another important thing with these is they like to jump, and they can jump hard. They're little torpedoes. So if I were to try and keep one in this tank, well, for one thing, I would never put them in either of these tanks. Probably too bright for them. Too much rock, right? But the other thing is these lids are hard. So what does that do when one of these fish jumps into one of these? Bam, knocks itself out, breaks bones, hurts it, right? Messes up its jaw, then it can't eat. Actually, this netting right here, this is kind of perfect, right, for them. It's almost like a trampoline when they hit it. So a lid on it that is soft, that can kind of give a little bit, is really critical for these guys because they do like to jump, especially in the first, first few weeks, whatever, when they're getting used to being in a tank. This is what they construct in the wild. They construct these mounds, and this is what they live in. You can think of it almost like a beaver nest, right? They actually go out and grab these chunks of coral rock rubble and basically build like a big old nest for themselves, and then they dart down into those. Some of the species don't actually construct these. They're not quite as big. They just find natural areas that simulate this, whereas some will build it. You don't necessarily need, these are big things too. I've seen them. They're pretty massive structures. You don't necessarily need to have a tank this size just for them to build that mound, but consider that if you're going to put these in a tank. There's a nice big wide open area with some sand, put some coral rubble, even like that, those calcium reactor bits, right, that you get would be perfect for them. A mix of that and sand, they would love it, and they'll just construct it on their own. And if you can do it in a lower light tank, awesome. Maybe it's a non-photosynthetic or it's a mushroom tank, whatever. Here's another fish, completely made moot by captive bred individuals now. This is the mandarin fish, mandarin goby. It's not actually a goby, it's just its own thing. It's a mandarin fish. And you can find these captive bred now. So just feed them pellets and flakes or whatever they eat, you know. But in the past, these were considered super difficult to keep. They typically only eat like copepods, right? And I've seen a lot of people try these and fail. They don't necessarily eat frozen mysis and stuff like that. Sometimes you'll get an individual that does, awesome, great. But a lot of people, what a lot of people found was that they just had really nice big reef tanks, mature reef tanks with a lot of live rock. And they would never even actually feed this fish. They just put it in the tank and it would just go around pecking at the rocks all day long. And they're avoiding putting in fish like 6-line wrasses and other fish that are competing for that same food source, right? And it's just this natural environment for this fish. It's this beautiful setup, right? Where you don't even really have to do anything. Just let them thrive in the environment you've created. Just a real quick story. I knew a guy in college that had a tank with 2 of these. And it was the most god-awful tank you've ever seen in your life. It was covered in green hair algae. It's probably about the size of this tank right here. He had live rock all over. He was trying to keep all kinds of corals and he couldn't do it because he sucked at being a reef keeper. I hate to say it. He's anonymous, so nobody knows who he is. But the tank was covered in green hair algae everywhere, right? What does green hair algae do? Breeds copepods. Copepods love eating it. Amphipods too. He had 2 of these in there. Fat, sassy, best looking mandarin fish I've ever seen in my life. They looked so awesome. And other people would come in and say, that's a terrible looking reef tank like I just did, right? But at the same time, back to the fish's eye view, from the perspective of the mandarin fish, that tank was perfect for them, right? So again, just thinking about these things from the perspective of what that fish wants, what that fish needs. Just give it what it needs, right? Pipefish, okay? I'm gonna show you 2 groups of pipefish, 2 genera of pipefish. This is one, I forget the Latin name, Dunkerocampos, I think it is, or something like that. These all kind of look similar, have a similar look. They're very thin, they've got this kind of big circle tail. Again, if you're these are all wild photos. Something you notice about these is that they're found in areas with a non-photosynthetic coral there. This kind of looks like darker, some lower light algae growing in there. These are typically found in like recesses of the reef, kind of cavey areas. Not necessarily super deep, but they like a recess to hide in. The one on the top left is the blue stripe pipefish. It's probably the easiest of the group. Typically will eat Hikari mysis within a couple weeks. If you wanted to keep these, I would plan on getting live mysids available to them for the first, say, 2 or 3 weeks. And if when I say live mysids, you look at me and go, what the hell are you talking about? The way to get those, I think, for people in this area, one, you can buy them. There's places on the East Coast that'll ship them out here. They collect them in little tidal flats or whatever in Florida, and they'll ship them out here. It costs a fortune. Does anybody know where Lake Merced is in San Francisco? Yeah. Lake Merced has live mysids in it. Does anybody know that? Yeah. Okay. So if I'm suggesting you do all this legally, by the way. Get your fishing license, look into the legal aspects of it. I did it a long time ago. We did it back then. Laws may have changed, and I don't want to get anybody in trouble. But if you go to Lake Merced at night, you don't even need a flashlight. They're already at the surface. There is a dock there. There's a rowing club there. It's got a dock longer than this room. And you get a pipe, piece of PVC pipe or a broomstick or whatever, zip tie a fish net about that big to the end of that pipe, and just walk down the dock, right, with that net in tow. And you're basically creating a trawl, right? And you'll get a handful of mysids. It's a freshwater lake, but these are actually derived. It used to be, whatever, I guess, back before the last ice age or whatever, it used to be a saltwater lagoon, and so this is originally a seawater mysid, but now it's been converted to freshwater. You could set up a little tank at home, you know, with a sponge filter for freshwater animals, not that difficult. And they're about the size of a Piscine energetics mysid. So now you know how to get them. And these guys will love those. Try to target the little ones if you can, the little mysids. A tank like this, for example, where I would expect to be finding a pipefish if I were to put these in here, and these would do great in this tank, I would say. They'd be hanging out right in here under this rock, probably all the time, right? They'd come out and dart out and get food and stuff, but just an idea of where you would see them and where they would feel most at home is in an area like that.
Even in super high flow.
Even in high flow, yeah.
So I used to have a couple in there, and they'd be underneath that big rock towards where you are,
Really?
along the bottom there.
And I didn't know that.
Now, when they eat. Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, so the blue stripe pipefish too, interesting thing about it is it's also a part-time cleaner. It's not as much of an obligate relationship as like a cleaner wrasse, but it does clean fish that are in more like kind of more secretive fish, like swordfish, cardinal fish, moray eels that typically hang in dark caves on the reef. These guys will pick parasites off of them. So, a different type of pipefish. This is, the genus is Corythoichthys. What do you notice right off the bat when you look at the wild photos of where these are found, right? They're on corals. They're on corals that we know like a lot of light. And just the way they act too. The last ones are more free swimming. They're not really touching the bottom. These guys are almost always laying on the bottom, right? And kind of slinking around almost like a snake. You can find them in these kind of, as you can see here, you can find them in these kind of rubbly zones adjacent to coral areas, kind of where the reef meets the sand also. You don't really find them on the sand so much though. They're almost always on a coral or near a coral. So for a tank like these, they'd kind of be good. These guys typically will eat stuff inside of coral heads, branching stony corals, and on the tops of like brain corals and things like that. I think that people use these also for red bugs, right? The dragon-faced pipefish, anybody familiar with using those for red bugs? Anybody ever try that before? Okay. It's one method suggested for eradicating them, managing them, if you don't want to use interceptor or whatever, noldomycin for red bugs. Just a different genus, different biology, different way to live, and just meeting what they want in your tank. That is the end of my talk. And I want to thank everyone here for coming. And cheers to Kenny for setting this up. Thank you, sir. Yeah, and I'll take any questions you might have about anything I talked about. Yeah.
We can talk about it for a second. But at the Monterey Aquarium, the new deep exhibit with rules, which you can see if you haven't already.
So I'm just going to repeat the question, just for the question was about when we built the Into the Deep at the aquarium and kind of what water quality things are we thinking about. A very common question is, do we change the pressure? Do we create the pressure in those tanks? We don't. Yeah. A lot of the animals there, they either don't have the fish that we're exhibiting, they don't have a swim bladder, or it's a swim bladder that's filled with oil, not gas, because they live so deep. And then certain things like jellies and comb jellies, they're almost all water, so they don't actually need the pressure. The story is a little bit more complex than that. A lot of the things we're exhibiting are either relatives of evolutionarily recent more surface-dwelling animals, so that they have the physiology that can go shallower. And in some cases, we're exhibiting, say, corals that they don't need the depth per se, they don't need the pressure, they just need the cold. So you might find them in the Monterey Canyon at 1,000 meters, but you go up to Alaska and they're found in diving depths, right? Because it's the right temperature. So they also don't need the dark necessarily. What happens too with a lot of animals, and one of the things that people ask us is about the anglerfish, right? We wish we could keep an anglerfish. An anglerfish, it will just never work unless you keep it in a pressurized environment. The reason for that is when you add pressure to the fish, you're adding pressure to its enzymes, its cellular membranes, proteins, things like that. And by doing that, it changes the shape of those. They conform to the pressure. If you do enough molecular biology, you know that the shape of those proteins, right? Like the spike protein on COVID is very, very important for it to function properly. You release that pressure, and then it is like taking the spring off of it, changes shape, no longer works properly. And the reason that some of those animals that live down there we can get away with that is that They either come to the surface naturally on their own, they do migrations at night to come up to the surface, or they have their genes have basically not been adapted to the deep for very long. To answer your question, we do make the water temperature much colder. It's anywhere from it's down as cold as 38 degrees Fahrenheit in some cases. We're lowering the oxygen for some tanks down to about 5% of saturation. When the process of pulling the oxygen out also pulls CO2 out, which means the pH goes much higher, which we have to counteract by adding CO2. The pH down in the deep is typically a lot lower than it is at the surface, of course. And that's the big things. Yeah. Yeah. Terrence, I think you had one?
One of the things I noticed with one of the things with the Moorish idol,
Yeah.
talk about fisheye view is in diving. I've seen them out in the wild, often in pairs, and often cruising, over large portions of the reef,
Yeah.
which is very difficult to simulate our heavy rock
Yeah.
escapes that we have too.
Yeah. Yeah, lots of space. One thing I didn't talk about too, that I should have, is, and this is more, a lot of this stuff applies to when you first get fish in, right? And keeping them for the first few months, getting them over that hurdle. But long term, one of the things I think is important is a good balanced diet, of course. Same things that you're thinking about for your own health. Diet and exercise, right? And exercise is actually the flow in the tank. And there's stuff that shows that, antheists, for example, benefit from the higher flow. When you have higher flow, they actually tend to spread out more, less interaction. And simply by doing something like dropping the food in more frequently, smaller amounts, they're also spending all their time worrying about getting food rather than you feed them this massive meal twice a day. They're all full, right? Now I got nothing better to do, so I'm going to fight with each other. You're kind of better off in all those regards. And giving them the exercise. A big thing long term is fatty liver disease with fish that we will have for decades or longer. They start to, the same thing with people. You start to get fat deposits around your organs. That puts pressure on your organs. Bad all around. And it's a real easy thing to happen in captivity because we're feeding things with a lot of saturated fat in them, and the fish aren't maybe getting as much exercise as they would on a wild reef. So.
And they're living longer.
And yeah, they're living longer. Yeah, that too. They're not getting eaten by the time. Yeah, yeah. Yes, in the back.
Talking about difficult fish. So I recently got
3 baby octopuses? Cool. Do you know what species? Well, the right person to ask this would have been Rich last month. Well, it'll be interesting to see how that works out. Typically, people keep that species of octopus by itself.
Yeah, take them to eat each other.
And most of them, yeah, they're solitary animals, right? Covering the tank, I mean, that's just a matter of, you need to put something very heavy on the top. Yeah, I mean, we designed the tank from the get-go knowing there's going to be an octopus inside of it, so it either has a very heavy lid or a lid with thumb screws. Water penetrations are gone through the sides so there's not little cracks, and then it's a bulkhead. All these things are thought about ahead of time. Yeah, they're challenging. They should do well though, I mean, as long as you can keep them in the tank. The thing I would recommend too to just prevent them from wanting to wander is, it's kind of counterintuitive with octopuses. People want to see them all the time, so they'll maybe just give them a rock. You actually want to fill the tank up with rock. The more hiding places you can give them, the better. And counterintuitively, they'll actually come out more when they feel more secure and they have more places to hide. We should chat more after the talk about that, because octopus are one of my favorites. So yeah. Yes?
Quick question. Did you do for the Monterey Bay Aquarium exhibit for the water stuff? How much talking did you do with the Vancouver Aquarium people where the aquarium is 90% cold, deep, and dark?
How much what did we do with?
Did you do any collaboration with the Vancouver Aquarium?
Oh, okay. Did we do any collaboration with the Vancouver Aquarium when we did the deep sea exhibit?
Yeah.
I don't remember ever collaborating with them, to be honest.
They're super chill. I used to work at Marine Mammal Rescue. You should do.
Okay. I mean, we're always in communication with, it's a small world, so we're always in communication with them. We really wanted to build an exhibit that was completely unique. We actually did a little bit more collaboration with folks in Japan. The back of my business card is in Japanese. That's how much we communicate with them. And if you've ever been to Japan and get a chance to see the public aquariums there, they have public aquariums in like every town that are amazing. I think Tokyo has like 4 or 5 like awesome public aquariums that are worth visiting. And they do a lot of deep sea aquariums. They actually have an aquarium in the town of Numazu that is strictly about deep sea animals. The entire place is about that. I would say though that what we tried to do was animals that nobody else is exhibiting. And I know for sure that there are several animals when you go and visit that exhibit that you cannot see anywhere else in the world. And it's kind of a neat thing to walk up to a tank and know that you're the only human being on the planet looking at that animal at that particular moment. Not just that particular animal, that species, right? Nobody else is seeing it. The only other person that might be seeing it is somebody looking through an ROV camera, maybe. What are the odds of that, really? So it's kind of a neat thing. And the reason for that is, one, we have our own ROVs. Some of these animals you can't collect unless you're collecting it yourself. It's too deep to dive to it. You can't get it with a trawl or whatever. You have to have an ROV that can collect it without touching it, essentially. Bring it up to the surface. I know that no other aquarium is doing the low oxygen thing that a lot of these animals need, they require. So yeah, come see it. I think it's cool. I think it's probably the most ambitious aquarium exhibit that anybody's ever done. I'm like super proud to have worked on it. We've been doing R&D on it for the last like 6 years, ever since I worked there. So they do cool, I know at the Vancouver Aquarium, they do cool, I don't know if they still do them, but they go up to the Hudson Bay to collect Arctic animals.
They still do.
Yeah, awesome, and that's awesome. I mean, super cool. Love ideas like that, so. Yeah, sorry, you got a question.
I'm in the middle of setting up my own auto feeder, I might steal some of your ideas. So
Go for it, please.
Please don't sue me for copyright.
No. I want people to copy it. I want people to copy it. Yeah.
Now, what would your recommendation be for a feeding schedule?
For a feeding schedule, yeah. So it's about like how often. What are you trying to feed, or is it for corals or is it for fish?
Fish, and of course I'm gonna have some.
I mean, it kind of depends on the fish and stuff, right? But for corals, I mean, honestly, I feel like I'm not the most qualified person to even say that. I know there's a lot of people who are like hardcore SPS keepers and stuff. Honestly, for me, when I look at Acropora, Terrence was showing me a picture of an Acropora earlier, and he's like, this is Acropora robusta. I didn't know that. Like, I just look at it as it's an acro. I don't get super geeky about all the coral names and all that stuff, but I have acro grown at home. I have that set up. I'm doing like Phyto Feast, Oyster Feast, and Reeferoids in that little bottle, and doing it twice a day. I do one in the middle of the day, and then I do one just after lights out for some of the stuff that opens up, like Acanthastria and what's the other one? Yeah, the Bower Bank Eye that opens up at night. Feeding some of those guys when they open up. And then I don't have to think about it, right? And that little jar, I think it lasts like 5 weeks or something like that. So I don't have to go and, if I'm not there, if I'm on vacation or whatever, I don't have to even think about it. I just have to refill it every month and a half or whatever. So makes things way simpler. I love to automate stuff like that. So yeah, John.
Oh, I was going to mention for the fridge for feeding, Scott Sweet in the club, he posted a thread about that a couple years ago, and he went through every detail. He first just showed like, hey, look what I built. And we're like, well, okay, can you walk us through? So he showed a bunch of details about exactly how he built and his plans and why he did this and not that. And he did an event with us where he showed us that as well as some other automation stuff. And he was at the event yesterday and he was telling us he wants to do it again for people that didn't see the first.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
So maybe look at Scott Sweet's post.
Okay.
Maybe we can look for an event maybe later with the next year about automation and the drift in the fridge.
Yeah, the I don't know, I'm sure there's a ton of different dosing pumps that can do it too, but I use those little Kamoer Pro dosing pumps because you can set the time.
Like he used the GHL.
Yeah, I'm sure there's like a, yeah.
That one fit perfect for the fridge you wanted.
Oh yeah.
But it looked very similar to the one you did, so you guys probably were looking at the same.
Same idea, different people. Yeah, I'm sure it's not a unique idea. I've just never seen it posted anywhere. So
He did the one where the tube goes all the way through, which, as you said, has a bounce
Oh, okay.
all the warm water to the little.
yeah, the chiller I use, it doesn't have a compressor. It's just like that Peltier effect. So it's not very effective. It kind of struggles on hot days to pull the temperature down. So it's like, why not give it as much help as you can?
You didn't think that Peltier one would get cold enough?
Mine totally does. It gets down in the.
If it's cold before you put it in, it's probably okay. We try to put it in warm.
Yeah, of course I'm in Monterey too. I'm near the ocean, but I don't have an air conditioner in my place. Even on the hottest days in summer, it was hanging out at like 39, 40 degrees. So, which is where our fridge should be, right? It should be like 41, 40 degrees. So, yeah.
Yeah, I have a quick question. So I know there's like a lot more captive bred things available now, right? And they're a lot easier in terms of like the food requirements. But
Yep.
do you feel like that captive bred fish have any, if there's any compromises on like the environmental requirements also?
So the question's about like a captive bred fish and the compromises on environmental.
Yeah, like, you know, if they're really more used to like, you know, being in a darker space or being in a deeper water fish, if they're captive bred, does that mean they're easier to keep in a more well-lit environment, or is it the same husbandry?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a really good question. And the question really that we're asking, right, is like, does that stuff go away, or is it sort of instinctual? And if it's been raised up, you know, one thing that I think is probably pretty inflexible is temperature. I don't know, I feel like fish, you know, temperature, if you kind of keep something a little bit warmer than it usually is found at, it doesn't manifest itself right away. Perfect example would be a Catalina goby, right? Catalina gobies are found down in Catalina, down in SoCal. And you'll see them on websites and they'll say, oh, these are found from, you can keep them from like 65 to 74 or 75. Well, 75 is what they're found at the northernmost part of their range on the hottest day in summer, right? It's not really what they would be found at year round. And in fact, if you put them at 75 in your tank, they will live probably for like a year or so. But if you keep them at like 65, 60, they're gonna live like decades, right? And I think it's something that I also see with the Borbonius anthias, which I know is captive bred now. You know, they sell it as like a 78-degree fish, but really it's not found from that temperature. I don't know. I don't have any long-term experience with a captive one versus a wild one, and I've never kept one that warm. I would just naturally be inclined to keep it a little cooler. We had some Borbonius at Steinhart. I think they're probably still there in the Twilight Zone exhibit that are like massive. And we're keeping them at 68 degrees. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know. I'm comfortable saying I have no idea. Questions. Really good questions. Thank you. Yeah, okay. I'm here all night. Let me know if you got any more questions. Thank you. Thanks.